Carrie Bradshaw never actually loved Mr. Big, and she physically couldn't have for one simple reason. Mr. Big never existed. 6 seasons, 2 feature films, hundreds of thousands of tears, and millions of women around the world sighing at their screens, whispering, "I want a love like that." We were sold this story as the gold standard of passion, the defining fairy tale of the 2000s, where a complicated but epic love wins out in the end. Except there was no epic love. For years, a bright, talented woman wasn't building a relationship. She was chasing a man who didn't exist, running from reality straight into her own barren fantasies. The same way other people run into a bottle. She wasn't in love with a living, breathing man. She was in love with her own projection, and that's exactly why she suffered. Today we're breaking down the show that defined a generation. Why unrequited love isn't romance, it's a serious illness, whose approval was Carrie really chasing every time she staked out Big's building. And why is this love story actually a textbook case study in psychological dependency? Turn on your critical thinking. Let's get into it. The central paradox of this show is that from the very first scene, Carrie puts Mr. Big on a pedestal, huge, significant, unreachable, while making herself small, scared, and fragile beside him. The man's real name is John. The audience doesn't find that out until the series finale. And that detail says everything. For 6 full seasons, this man's actual name and identity never mattered. He wasn't a man to her. He was a projection, a myth, a concept. Carrie has zero interest in who he actually is. She doesn't want an ordinary man with ordinary flaws and ordinary problems. You can only fall in love with a real person, and in 6 seasons, Carrie never once tries to find out who John really is. Instead, she builds a perfect image in her head and starts worshiping it. Underneath this is a whole toolkit of psychological defenses and cognitive distortions, all of them cutting her off from reality. First, idealization and projection, working here as classic psychological armor. Idealization is the unconscious process of inflating someone into flawless perfection while ignoring their actual flaws. We see this the moment Carrie learns John was married before. She completely unravels, because the fact that he has an ex-wife shatters her mental image of him as some unspoiled monument with no messy past. Instead of accepting reality, she starts stalking his ex-wife, trying to crack the code of the ideal. Projection is when someone takes their own hidden motives, desires, or, in Carrie's case, their own deep-seated insecurities about money, status, and self-worth, and pins them onto someone else. Carrie takes that template and slaps it onto John, casting him as a kind of god. That's exactly what's happening when she secretly follows his mother into church. She's projecting her own need for unconditional acceptance and parental approval, genuinely believing his family holds the cure for her insecurity. From there, the cognitive distortions kick in personalization and self-centered thinking. Personalization is the mental error of taking responsibility for things that have nothing to do with you and reading them as somehow your fault. When John takes Carrie to a hole-in-the-wall Chinese restaurant instead of somewhere trendy downtown, she instantly spirals, convinced he's embarrassed to be seen with her. It never crosses her mind that he might just genuinely like the place. Self-centered thinking is the inability to imagine that the world isn't revolving entirely around you. Because of this combination, Carrie is convinced every single thing John does is somehow about her. When he announces a long work trip to Paris, she gets tunnel vision instantly. She throws a full-blown fit and hurls food at the wall, because in her worldview, there's only one possible explanation. He's leaving to get away from me. She's physically incapable of factoring in his career, his life, anything outside her own reaction. Any silence from him gets read as her own fault. What did I do wrong? What's wrong with me? You can also read all of this through attachment theory. There's an anxious attachment style, where someone is terrified of being abandoned, constantly chases closeness with a partner, and needs endless reassurance that they're loved. And there's a disorganized attachment style, a messier, more deeply wounded pattern where a strong pull toward intimacy, the anxious side, collides with an equally strong fear of that same intimacy, the avoidant side. So the person swings back and forth between chasing a partner and running from them. Carrie shows anxious attachment that tips over into disorganized. The anxious side is what drives her to chase big, cross his boundaries, and stake out his mother at church against every rule of decency. But the moment she's faced with someone stable and safe, Aidan, her avoidant, disorganized side switches on instantly. Stability and safety scare her, so she refuses to meet Aidan's parents, sabotages the closeness, and bolts. She only knows how to function while chasing someone unavailable. From a psychoanalytic angle, Carrie has what you'd call a diffuse, unstable sense of self. Identity diffusion is when a person has no solid, stable sense of who they are, no clear grip on their own values, needs, or boundaries. Their identity becomes blurry, completely dependent on outside validation and mirroring. Carrie has no internal core, so her sense of self collapses the moment John marries Natasha. Instead of grounding herself, Carrie becomes obsessed with picking apart her rival, hunting for any flaw at all. She desperately needs to reassure herself that John's choice doesn't mean something is broken or wrong with her. And tellingly, the only thing that actually lets her let go is finding a stupid spelling mistake in Natasha's thank you note. Her sense of self gets patched up not through growth, but through the thought, she's not perfect, so I'm not less than her. John isn't a partner to Carrie. He's an emotional drug that fills a hollow ache inside her, and for a moment, makes her feel alive. To understand why a grown, successful, attractive woman like Carrie spends years signing up to be someone's emotional hostage, we need to go back to where every one of our love scripts is actually written: childhood. The show itself only hints at this, but the character's official backstory spells it out clearly. Carrie's father walked out on the family when she was a small child. And that absent father became the invisible director, quietly running her entire love life. Psychologically, when a father figure vanishes from a little girl's life without warning, it carves out a deep deficit of safety and validation in her still-forming sense of self. A child can't process adult problems, so she draws the only conclusion her self-centered, developing mind is capable of: Dad left because I wasn't good enough. If I were perfect, they wouldn't have left me. That's the birthplace of a core wound around rejection and the self-worth deficit that comes with it. It plants a hard rule inside Carrie. Love is something you have to constantly earn, prove, and fight the world for. Grown into an adult with this wound, a woman genuinely cannot build calm, healthy relationships, because in her subconscious, love and safety have been permanently pried apart. Steady, predictable, loving Aidan feels bland and boring to her precisely because he doesn't trigger her childhood wound. There's nothing to fight for, nothing to survive. Meanwhile, cold, elusive John becomes the perfect trigger. Her nervous system instantly recognizes him as the father who left. This is where compulsive repetition kicks in, the subconscious drive to keep recreating the scene of your childhood defeat, over and over, this time hoping for a different ending. Her entire obsession with John is an immature attempt to catch up to a father who's already walking away, grab the hem of his coat, and force him to turn around. It feels like, if this distant, unavailable, closed-off man finally chooses me, puts a ring on my finger, and calls me his, my childhood wound heals, I'll finally prove that I'm worthy of love. Carrie isn't fighting for John. She's desperately trying to rewrite her past, using a real, living man as a tool to patch an old childhood deficit. This wound shows up in the show through specific, very precise markers. The first is one of the rare moments Carrie says her past out loud, in her own words. He quit my mother and me when I was little. Here's how the psychology works. When a parent disappears at that age, 5 in Carrie's case, a girl seals that loss away. We don't know much about her relationship with her mother, but one thing is obvious. Adult Carrie has an almost impossible time absorbing criticism. Her fragile sense of self shatters at the first sign of disapproval. In the same episode, while working on pieces for Vogue, Carrie brings her writing to the demanding, icy editor Enid Frick, who tears the work apart. Instead of taking the professional notes on the chin, Carrie falls apart completely. She sits down with her colleague Julian and starts drinking. Actually getting drunk at work to numb the sting to her ego. From then on, she panics around Enid, tries to route everything through Julian instead, and only goes back to dealing with the tough editor directly, once she realizes her colleague was just hitting on her. The second and most painful expression of this wound is the season 2 finale. When John gets back from Paris, they meet at a restaurant, and Carrie learns he's serious about a much younger Natasha. In that moment, Carrie is hit with a brutal truth. All this time, John had been feeding her lines like, "I'm just not the marrying kind, and I'm never getting married again." And Carrie does something rare for her. She makes the one clear-eyed, sobering observation she's capable of and asks him point-blank, "So, you just didn't want to marry me?" That single line is a flash of pure reality cutting through everything. And it's unbearably painful for her. Her core belief, "Something's wrong with me, that's why I don't get chosen," gets confirmed in real time. And so that her mind doesn't completely fracture under the impact, Carrie immediately switches on one of her strongest defenses: rationalization. Combined with the self-centered distortion we talked about earlier. With her friends, she starts unpacking the movie The Way We Were, starring Barbara Streisand, and together they build a comforting mental theory. Carrie casts herself as the film's lead, Katie, complicated, wild, curly-haired, too much for most men to handle. Natasha, meanwhile, gets unanimously branded the obedient, simple girl. Carrie twists the story until it fits. John didn't choose Natasha because Carrie wasn't right for him. He chose her because he's too weak, too much of a coward to handle someone as complex and deep as Katie. It's a classic move for a wounded ego trying to save face. And by the time Carrie runs into John outside a hotel at the very end of the episode and asks her now famous question, "Why not me?" she's already fully armored in this theory. Her psyche did everything it could to help her survive that blow, stitching her old childhood wound shut with a fresh, flimsy thread of self-flattering illusion. For 6 seasons, Carrie Bradshaw walks the exact same closed loop. She gets back together with John, runs into his coldness, suffers, leaves, tries to build something normal with someone else, and the second big calls, she drops everything and runs back. From the outside, this looks like an epically drawn-out romantic drama. From a clinical standpoint, it's a textbook picture of addiction. The unrequited love Carrie lives through isn't a deep feeling. It's a heavy emotional dependency, and it runs on the exact same wiring in the brain as alcohol or drug addiction. Here's the paradox in the phrase: there's no such thing as unrequited love. Real love is always a two-way process, built on actual contact, exchange, and mutual effort. What Carrie is doing is pure addiction biochemistry. When a partner pulls you close and then shoves you away, which is exactly what John does, masterfully. All series long, it triggers what's called intermittent reinforcement in the brain of the person on the receiving end. It's the single most powerful mechanism there is for building attachment. When Carrie has no idea whether today she'll get a dose of warmth from John or slam into an ice wall, her dopamine system goes into overdrive. Waiting for rare, unpredictable approval triggers a massive dopamine spike, the hormone of anticipation. As a result, her brain permanently wires John's presence to survival and to peak pleasure. Steady, reliable Aidan, who offers warmth every single day, simply can't produce that kind of chemical high. For a brain that's already hooked on emotional whiplash, healthy love feels gray and flat. This is exactly why Carrie runs the same loop for 6 seasons. She's acting like a textbook addict in withdrawal. She's miserable without her fix, but the second she gets access to it, instead of peace, she gets a fresh hit of anxiety. She agrees to be the secret other woman once Big is already married to Natasha, wrecking someone else's marriage and trampling her own dignity in the process. Addiction wipes out critical thinking. For 1 second of relief, for the illusion of being chosen again, Carrie is willing to swallow any humiliation and betray herself over and over. Underneath this endless loop is a rigid, self-sustaining addiction cycle. It always starts with a trigger, a chance run-in, a phone call, or just a sudden wave of emptiness. That trigger instantly launches the obsession phase, where Carrie's mind floods with intrusive thoughts about where John is, who he's with, why he hasn't called. To quiet the mental panic, she moves into compulsive action, blowing up his phone, staking out his building, having him followed. For one brief moment, in the flash of reconnecting, Carrie gets the relief she's been craving. But the illusion of victory fades fast, followed inevitably by a crash laced with shame. Carrie realizes nothing has actually changed, and her self-esteem hits a new low. And right there, the cycle closes, only to start all over again. Carrie can't get off this leash, because John isn't just a man to her, he's an external regulator of her entire emotional state. Without him, she doesn't feel alive or worth anything. 6 seasons of this show aren't a story about a great love overcoming obstacles. It's the story of a chronic condition, where the obstacles are manufactured on purpose, to keep the dopamine tension running high and to avoid facing the real problem, the hollow ache underneath it all. And the scariest part is that this cycle has no logical ending. Even decades later, in the sequel And Just Like That, we see the exact same dynamic. John's death doesn't heal Carrie or set her free. Her mind simply swaps in a new unavailable target to keep the addiction fed. Now Aidan gets cast as the elusive, out-of-reach figure. Without hesitation, Carrie agrees to his terms, waiting years for his kids to grow up. Years pass, the scenery changes, but Carrie Bradshaw is still sitting at that window, stuck in the same childhood script, where love isn't mutual happiness in the here and now. It's an endless, agonizing wait for someone who's already decided to leave her again. The story of Carrie Bradshaw and Mr. Big is arguably the defining pop culture love myth of the early 2000s. Millions of women around the world cried at their screens, genuinely believing they were watching a beautiful fairy tale about a complicated, independent woman whose persistence finally melted a hardened bachelor's heart. But take off the rose-colored glasses and look at it with a cold, analytical eye, and it becomes obvious. Carrie wasn't in love with the real, living John, flaws and habits and selfishness included. She was in love with her own larger-than-life projection. John was perfectly cast for the role. He was rich, striking, mysterious, and crucially emotionally closed off. That emotional shutdown is exactly what made him a blank canvas. Carrie never tried to find out who he actually was, what he cared about, or why he was so terrified of commitment. Instead, her mind kept frantically filling in the details, turning an ordinary, emotionally immature man into an unreachable, perfect prince whose approval was supposed to heal every childhood wound in one shot. But the tragedy of any projection is that reality eventually catches up with it and shatters it. And every time the real John did something that didn't fit her perfect internal script, leaving for Paris, secretly marrying someone else, keeping her at arm's length, Carrie was in unbearable pain. But instead of admitting, "This man simply can't give me what I need," she doubled down, rationalizing his behavior, inventing theories about complicated women versus simple women, and chasing him even harder. Carrie and John's relationship is an important marker for every one of us. It's a reason to stop and ask yourself one honest, uncomfortable question. Who are you actually in love with in your own relationships? The real person sitting across from you, with their flaws, their bad moods, their imperfect personality, their actual behavior. Or the beautiful, idealized figure your mind built out of a starved need for attention, old childhood wounds, and the fear of being alone. Every time we spend years trying to earn someone's love, every time we excuse coldness being ignored, emotional whiplash. And constant disappearing acts with lines like, "He's just complicated," "She had a rough past," or "We're meant to be together, no matter the obstacles, we're doing exactly what Carrie Bradshaw did." We're swapping a real person for our own projection. We're trying to cast someone in the role of the perfect parent who will finally show up, choose us, and prove that we're worth something. Learning to tell your projection apart from reality is a huge, painful, but absolutely necessary step toward growing up emotionally and building a healthy relationship.